Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. Thank you so much for attending. Welcome to this seminar discussion on digital approaches to Gulf studies, introducing OpenGulf, hosted by the NYUAD Humanities Research Fellowship for the Study of the Arab World. My name is Natalie Poetz. I'm Associate Professor of Arab Crossroads Studies and Anthropology at NYU in Abu Dhabi. And I'm very pleased to be moderating this event this evening and to be introducing our panelists. Before I begin the introductions, I'd just like to say that if you have any questions, please ask questions and put them in the Q&A as opposed to in the chat. And if you would like to direct your questions to a specific particular panelist, please go ahead and add their name in the Q&A as well. So we have with us tonight these amazing founders of this project. Nora Barakat, Assistant Professor of History at Stanford University. Nora is historian of the late Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East. Her research focuses on people, commodities, and landscapes in the interior regions between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean in the 19th and 20th centuries. She has a particular interest in how legal categories of population, property, and economy shaped and were shaped by the everyday experiences of social life. She is also committed to bringing both the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East into discussions of world history, especially narratives about capitalism and modern state formation. She teaches courses on modern Middle Eastern history, capital and crisis, Islamic law, and environmental history. Sufan Kermeziyaltan is a visiting assistant professor of Middle Eastern history, also at NYU Abu Dhabi, Sufan Kermeziyaltan, her research interests center around the intersections of gender and modernization in the Middle East with the specific context of the Ottoman modernization project. Her current research involves deep learning methods for the automated transcription and analysis of historical archives, as well as the crowdsourced transcription of Ottoman Turkish print media. Also at NYU Abu Dhabi is David Risley, Associate Professor of Digital Humanities. He's an interdisciplinary scholar teacher with research interests in comparative approaches to medieval literature in European languages and Arabic, digital spatial approaches to corpora, neural methods for handwritten text recognition across writing systems, and open knowledge community building in the Middle East, where he has lived and researched since 2002. In Abu Dhabi, he co-founded the Winter Institute in Digital Humanities in 2020 with Beth Russell, who was not able to be here today, but who is I don't have her official title here. She is the director of digital humanities in the library.
She's the head of the Center for Digital Scholarship in NYU.
Digital Scholarship. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. So again, I'll just remind people who've joined just now to put your questions in the Q&A, please, instead of the chat. But first, we'll begin with the panelists, and we very much look forward to hearing your introduction to OpenGulf. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Natalie, for the introduction. It's really nice. I'm going to start us off with a small introduction to the project. So just give me 1 second in order to share my slides. And let's see here. So share screen. Can you see my slides? All good? Okay. Okay, so thanks so much everyone for attending our talk today. I'm really looking forward to talking about this with you today. Our talk is going to be with common slides, but we're going to each break off and talk about some different aspects of the talk tonight. We'd like to thank the Humanities Research Fellowship for the study of the Arabic world, or the Arab world, for the invitation to speak today. The projects that we're going to be talking about today have been ongoing for, let's say, the last 3 years or so, since about 2018, and more about that a little bit later. So just for a little outline of our talk tonight, we're going to say a little bit about OpenGulf as a project. We're going to try to situate that inside of what people would have known as Gulf studies. We're going to outline some of what we call value-centered, community-based research is in digital history. And then we're going to speak about 3 projects. The first is working with Lorimer's Gazetteer, the second one with papers from the Bushire residency and handwritten text recognition, and finally a project known as Abu Dhabi Calling that works with phone directories from the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. And then after that, we'll have a small conclusion. So OpenGulf is a transdisciplinary, multi-institutional research group for digital historical projects related to the Gulf region. The group is also working on a number of different projects connected by their geographical focus, of course, but also by specific approaches to digital scholarship. We'd like to argue that for parts of the world, such as the Gulf countries, and for fields such as Gulf studies, digital historical research is by no means an obvious endeavor. OpenGulf strives to develop strategies that address the complexities of designing, launching, and sustaining digital historical research, including very important steps of identifying, digitizing, and assembling data in order to create a more expansive notion of the archive. OpenGulf is working to lay a foundation for digital work in Gulf studies that re-examines sources, some very well known and others totally ignored for the region, privileging diverse teams of faculty, early career researchers, and student research interns working together to develop new skills, to open new research horizons, and to promote inclusive pedagogies and to center new voices. So the field that we're aware that there may be colleagues that come from different kinds of fields here on the call, and some who are not even from the Gulf region. So permit me just a little bit of background. The Gulf Studies is situated somewhere within or between the fields of Middle East and South Asian studies, between the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean worlds. The Arabian Peninsula, pictured on the satellite image on the slide here, has had many layers of imperial history associated with it: Portuguese, Safavid, Dutch, French, Ottoman, British, Qajar, Russian, German, etc. As a field of scholarly knowledge production, largely in English and from the Anglo-American world, the existing literature has focused on ruling regimes in the Gulf and the British Empire. We believe that there's much potential in the fragmented archival landscape of the former empires present in the region, a belief shared by the Qatar National Library and its digital library, and the way that they've been putting together that library. The digital for us is really key to Gulf studies, given the accessibility of various archives to global researchers. We also believe, as we will discuss today, that the digital is not only important for gaining access to archives, but also for tapping into them, for finding common ground on what they can do for us, how they can be compared, as well as for organizing and disseminating our research results. So what we're going to be doing today is introducing you to 3 projects. They're not the only projects that we've actually done. We've done a handful more, but they're the ones that stand out to us for the challenges and opportunities presented by team-based digital research. On the slide, we've listed some of the characteristic qualities we try to infuse our projects with and strive to model in our research practices. Digital humanities and digital history are a youthful enterprise at NYU Abu Dhabi, and no less so in the greater region of Western Asia. So I think it can be helpful to explain what some of those values are, or at least list them, many of which we draw from examples of different global digital research teams. We're going to argue today that not only is project design a key to the success of our digital work, but this value-driven collective work is also a signature trademark of our research group. So let me just read some of these values that are here on the screen. One of the things that we try to model in all of the sub-projects that we're carrying out: new ways of dealing with large amounts of information, or what is sometimes called distant approaches, critical uses of technology and ethical practices for creating data sets, team creation of knowledge based on collaboration and consensus, including the participation of a wide range of stakeholders, especially undergraduates, adopting minimal sustainable infrastructure when possible, linking data and making it open where possible so that it can be reused and compared, having project work as an opportunity, or seeing project work as an opportunity for skills acquisition, acknowledging of the work of all stakeholders in our projects, including co-authorship and co-presentation. We strive to have multilingual approaches to the Gulf, not only English ones, to center new voices in Gulf studies and global history in general, And finally, widening a body of sources for historical knowledge production about the region, including cutting-edge technologies for digitization and data capture. Now, it would be inappropriate for me to proceed without acknowledging the many people, some of whom you see on the screen here, most of whom came from NYU Abu Dhabi, and most of whom are undergraduates who have worked as research assistants over the years. Some of these names have other institutions, and in some of those cases, those are actually NYU Abu Dhabi students who have moved on to do graduate work in other places. So we like to think of OpenGulf as a transdisciplinary research group that has an increasing network of participants. And with that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to hear about Lorimer and historical texts as data to my colleague, Nora.
Thank you, David. First, I just also want to thank the Humanities Research Fellowship for the Study of the Arab World for the invitation to do this talk. It's really wonderful for me to be back at NYU AD, even if only virtually, to talk about OpenGulf. So OpenGulf really began in the core curriculum at NYU Abu Dhabi in 2018, as David mentioned, and in a class that I was teaching at the time called History and the Environment. And through talking with David and I joined the faculty at NYU AD at the same time, I had become interested in teaching students basic mapping and digital humanities skills. And so let's advance the slide. In that context, in my core class, History and the Environment, we chose to introduce students to these digital mapping skills with the text that you see on the left. This is Lorimer's Gazetteer of the Persian Gulf, Oman, and Central Arabia. This is a 5-volume historical and geographical compendium. It was compiled by John Gordon Lorimer, who was a British civil servant in the early 20th century. And we chose this text for 2 interrelated reasons. The first is that it's really iconic in Gulf studies. It's widely referenced by historians of the Gulf, especially but not only historians who are writing in English. It's also a really foundational piece of imperial knowledge production about the region, but it's often used rather uncritically as a reference source. It's used kind of like a dictionary. So scholars would kind of pull it off the shelf to look up a particular name or a particular place or a particular community. So mapping the locations in this text would give us a new take on the British production of spatial knowledge about the Gulf. The second reason we chose Lorimer may seem a little bit more mundane, but I hope that its importance to our whole process in OpenGulf becomes more obvious by the end of the presentation. It's related also to this foundational status of this text among historians of the Gulf, especially those who are writing in English. The text is readily available and digitally accessible. So when we started, the Gazetteer was already available online. It was already OCR'd. There's an OCR'd version on archive.org, which you see in the image on the right. And Brill had already created a fully digitized and searchable version. And what all this meant was that we could easily create plain text files and use them to do different kinds of digital analysis, first in my class and then beyond as OpenGulf grew. So we began by having students in my class annotate the sections of Lorimer's Gazetteer on Abu Dhabi, on Ras Al Khaimah, on other locations that they were familiar with, which are now in the UAE. And they went through and highlighted the place names in the text and found coordinate information about them using different geographical databases online, Google Maps, GeoNames. And then we created maps of those sections to discuss in class. Let's move the slide. So over the next 2 years, while I was still at NYU AD, David and I scaled up the work we had done in my class. We focused on the geographical dictionary of Lorimer, not the historical section. We created text files of all 810 entries in the geographical dictionary and then hired student assistants on a semester-long basis to continue annotating those text files. And you can see our basic workflow on this slide. We annotated the text files using a tool called Recogito on the left. That allowed students to collaboratively tag place names and link them to geographical coordinates that they had found in this geographical database, GeoNames. That annotation process took 2 years. 9 students worked on it in semester-long student internships. We then exported the data from Recogito into Google Sheets, which you see here in the middle, and started the process of cleaning the data, which is ongoing. The final step is creating maps using GIS tools. This one on the right is one example, which was done in ArcGIS, and it's a map of all of the verified locations, actually not all of them, but all of them that fit into that screen that are mentioned in Lorimer's Gazetteer. Next slide, please. So what this work has produced is a very large data set, including over 50,000 annotations of both people and places within Recogito. We created that through Recogito, and a smaller set of about 20,000 unique locations that are linked to verified coordinates in GeoNames. As I mentioned, this process has involved 9 student assistants. It's also involved 5 summer PPTPs at NYU Abu Dhabi, 2 visiting researchers from NYU Shanghai and UAE University. We did a community data creation event in which we invited worldwide researchers to help us find places we had not been able to geolocate. That event was called the Gulfathon. The project has also become multi-institutional. This is partly because I moved to Stanford, but it's also because NYU-AD undergraduates, as David mentioned, moved on to graduate work and continued working with us. They have done student-led trainings. They've created online tutorials for students who are new to the project. The data set needs a lot of cleaning because it was produced by so many different people, and many toponyms are still difficult to identify. But this past summer, we started working with PPTP students to develop a system for verifying all of this data. So going row by row to check previous students' work and doing language-specific research around particular regions to check all of those locations and also try to locate ones that we haven't been able to find. That has involved finding students with relevant language abilities to be able to do that extensive historical, spatial research and verify our data. We have, though, already begun to showcase the kinds of analysis that the Lorimer data set enables. First of all, it gives us a compelling visual representation of the spaces of British knowledge, also the spaces of lack of British knowledge in the Gulf region. But we can also represent British knowledge production at a very granular level with this data set. So the map on the left depicts Lorimer's mentions of camels in the Gulf region by quantity. The map on the right was created with one of Lorimer's appendices. It indicates pearling communities in which a flag was protecting their industries in the first decade of the 20th century. Next slide. So from the first year of OpenGulf's operation, I was somewhat uncomfortable with giving so much time to a single British colonial source. This is a mode of research that I've really resisted in my work on the Eastern Mediterranean. So we've also started working in other languages. You can see on the slide French, Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and we're following a similar workflow that we followed with Lorimer. So preparing text, annotating it, and then mapping. This step has given us new tools for putting British spatial knowledge production within its historical context and really de-reifying British imperial modes of characterizing and categorizing space and landscapes. So David and I are working on a co-authored article now. One of the co-authors is NYU AD graduate Neda Maggie, who's doing her MA in Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown. And in that project, we're comparing Ottoman and British spatial knowledge production about Iraq and the Arabian Peninsula. And this work has the promise of showing us the specificities and practices of British knowledge production among a very competitive cohort of turn of the 20th century empires that includes the Ottoman and other regional interests. So what this work has also showed us is the extent to which this issue of accessibility that I mentioned before, the accessibility of text, shapes the timeline that we can work on and also what we're able to do. None of these texts that you see on the screen have been as easily accessible as Lorimer. For the ones in Arabic script, we have the added challenge that the tools we're using were not designed for Arabic script. And this is a foundational reason for OpenGulf's turn to other kinds of projects, and Supan is going to talk about one of them in a minute, especially involving handwritten text recognition, different methods for performing OCR on Arabic text, so that we can get to this point where we can digitally analyze texts beyond the British colonial realm. I want to just briefly mention our next steps with the Lorimer project, but just stay with this issue of the accessibility of text, because Suphan is really going to get into that in the next section of our presentation. Let's go to the next slide. So a main challenge as we move beyond Lorimer is how to improve our workflow so that we're integrating different texts about the same region in a way that remains accessible to our collaborators. And this goes back to those sort of mission statement bullet points that David articulated earlier in the presentation, right? We're really invested in bringing undergraduate researchers into our research team and keeping them interested and sustaining their interest over long periods of time. Especially collaborators also who don't have wide-ranging language skills, right? So how do we bring students in who don't necessarily have Arabic or maybe have another language that is relevant to our work, and have them all sort of held together by a similar workflow. We want to be able, we want to be able to welcome people who know very little about the Gulf to this project, not only to sort of learn about it, but also as creators of data. So that's one problem that we're constantly thinking about. Another problem is how to balance texts that represent different density and scale of geographic information. So the map on the right is actually two different Ottoman texts, one in Ottoman Turkish and one in Arabic. Both of them describe the Euphrates River Basin in southern Iraq. Their geography is very dense and very granular. This is in contrast with Lorimer's sort of capacious scope. So how can we put these sources together, sources that are really focused on one particular region for different imperial and non-imperial purposes? How can we put them together for productive comparison, right? And really make them speak to each other through visualization. Finally, perhaps the thorniest question is, what do we prioritize? The Gulf is an incredibly complex archival landscape. David already alluded to that. We're currently working on sources that range from these iconic texts like Lorimer to historical records collected from Twitter feeds, right? In a very different kind of sort of data collection process. What do we prioritize? What do we focus on making more accessible to the digital, both to digital analysis, but also to a wider audience of scholars, students, and also the public. And with that, I'm going to pass to Suphan to talk about automatic transcription of the Bushire residency letters.
Thank you, Nora. I just need a second to rearrange my screen. All right. Good evening, everyone. As Nora pointed out a minute earlier, the availability and accessibility of our sources play a decisive role in shaping the topics, the workflows, and timeline of our research. Therefore, part of the larger agenda of OpenGulf is to make a broader category of historical texts accessible to researchers by digitizing them, yes, but also by rendering these texts computer readable so that we can use computational tools for these materials and open them for reuse and high order analysis, such as the Gazetteer creation or the geographical data visualization works that Nora talked about. What I would like to present today is some of our work for transforming a digital archive of handwritten ledgers into searchable and computable format by using AI-assisted handwritten text recognition. The collection I am referring to is the handwritten letter books of the Office of the British Political Residency in the Gulf. These letters are part of the India Office records, and they have already been digitized and made available online by the Qatar Digital Library. And while talking about our Bushire residency project, I would also like to take the opportunity to highlight some of the unique challenges of applying digital humanities tools to historical archives and handwritten texts. And next slide, please. So the archive of the Bushire residency is of particular relevance for the study of the Gulf history. And the British was the highest ranking colonial official in the Gulf and coordinated the activities of the network of British political and commercial agents in the region in the 19th and the early part of the 20th centuries. The Bushire collection has been used in scholarly monographs on the Gulf by a handful of scholars, but we believe that it has not been fully exploited for what this archive can tell us about, for example, the circulation of goods in the Gulf region over the course of the 19th century, or the nature of the debates about the abolition of slavery, or the broader role that the Gulf region played in the functioning of the British Empire. To be able to ask these kinds of questions of the entire archive, we should be able to engage this document collection on a different level than is possible with analog methods and tools. And that really is the main point of our work in this project. As I already pointed out, these records have been digitized and made available online by the Qatar Digital Library. And while the digitization of this collection obviously increased its accessibility, as researchers do not need to travel to London or Doha anymore to access, to use these documents, the image files available at the QDL website are not computer readable. And thus, no keyword search can be performed in the documents. And the sheer volume of the available material renders distant reading of this source unfeasible. This archive is isolated from computer-assisted modes of analysis, and this collection is not yet data in the sense the word is used in digital humanities. David, next slide, please. Thank you. The Bushire digital collection has not been OCR'd, not due to lack of institutional interest or resources on the part of QDL, I believe, but mainly due to technical challenges that handwritten documents and historical texts present for OCR. Any machine learning approach requires the creation of training data for the neural network, including automatic text recognition with deep learning algorithms. The challenge for scholars who would like to use OCR for historical texts is that many of the commercial OCR tools that are available to us today are trained primarily with printed Latin script texts, English language texts, and texts that are scraped from the internet and thus rely on modern web content. As a result of this, commercially available OCR tends to yield very high error rates when applied to handwritten texts or to historical collections in general, even when these collections are in English language. Unless, of course, these OCR tools are specifically trained for the corpus in question. In our work with the Bushire collection, we use the HDR platform Transcribus. What makes HDR an ideal tool for working with historical collections is that it allows users to custom create their own training data, or ground truth in the HDR jargon, to recycle this ground truth for the retraining of the HDR engine, and last but not the least, to share the training data and the HDR model with the rest of the scholarly community. As a side note here, I would like to highlight that HDR is developed specifically for handwritten texts, but it also happens to work very well for printed material in cursive and connected scripts, such as Arabic. And in another project of mine, I am using Transcribus to automate the transcription of Arabic script Ottoman Turkish text to Latin script modern Turkish. For the Bushire collection, we have used the HDR platform to begin to construct hand-specific transcription models that are specialized for individual volumes, as well as generalized models that are capable of transcribing letters across a wider span of the collection. And so far, the results have been promising. For example, our latest general model, which was created based on approximately 100,000 words from 5 different volumes and includes at least 8 different handwriting. And that model is currently working at an error rate of 4.87%, which I believe is an encouraging outcome. I would like to conclude this section of my presentation by pointing out that we are aware that transcription is a biased process, and machine-facilitated transcription is no exception to this. The HCR algorithm relies on the language data provided by the transcriber and in turn reproduces the transcriber's linguistic bias in the output. And the language information we, as the creators of the training data for the AI, impose on the neural network does not only affect the quality and the readability of the output, but also has other important downstream implications. So we acknowledge that corpora creation is a complex political process, and with deep learning, computationally intensive models, this is no less the case. To be more explicit about what I mean by this, and also to highlight one of the distant reading tools that we are currently experimenting with in our project, in the second half of my presentation, I am going to briefly talk about our work with named entity recognition, or NER, for the machine transcribed Bushire corpus. Next slide. Named entities represent real-world objects in text, such as people, currencies, places, organizations, time and date, etc. In our work, we are not exclusively, but mostly interested in identifying people and place names that are mentioned in the Bushire letter books. And a small section of our corpus has already been manually tagged by student assistants for entity names, but automating this work with an NER system is going to allow us to scale up the data creation process, thus enabling us to develop a more in-depth computational approach to the corpus. And very much like the OCR systems that I mentioned earlier, most commonly used NER libraries have been trained on English language data scraped from the web. And our challenge in using NER for the Bushire collection is identifying named entities in a corpus that includes not only many historical entity names that might not be identifiable in external sources of information anymore, but also transliterated place and person names from Farsi and Arabic to English. To complicate the process even further, the non-English entity names were Romanized from their Arabic or Farsi originals without adhering to a consistent transliteration scheme. And sometimes they were vocalized and spelled in more than one way, even in the same document. So to address these issues, we are in the process of creating custom-trained NER models with Spacy, which is an NLP Python library that will hopefully be able to identify a good portion of the historical entities and transliterated entity names in our corpus. And among others, one of the distant reading approaches we intend to implement with the named entities extracted from our corpus is to build ladder correspondence networks. The example you see here on the slide was produced by David in Palladio and is based on a dataset extracted from a single volume. Our long-term vision for the Bushire corpus is to create a Persian Gulf colonial mapping version of the famous Republic of Letters project that maps the correspondence networks of the European and American intellectuals of the Enlightenment era and includes adjacent text for combined network and textual analysis. Next slide. To conclude my part of the presentation, I would like to highlight some of the broader research questions that our digital corpus creation work with HTR brings up. First of all, at the Bushire project level, we would obviously like to answer the question of with whom the Bushire residents corresponded. This correspondence was by no means limited to the British colonial officials, but also included letters sent to and received from local rulers and leaders. Who was writing and what were they writing about? On a more broader level, we have a version of the corpus available. We also would like to think in more detail about what forms of high-level textual analysis we can perform with that text. I have already touched upon annotation, NER, and network visualization, but in the group we are also talking about other forms of text analysis, such as topic modeling and data visualization with mapping. Of course, a major question for us is what contemporary audiences would be interested in or find value in such work. And finally, how can the HDR to distant reading workflow be adapted to other languages and other archives? What other handwritten or printed textual sources are good candidates for automatic transcription for the study of Gulf history? And I do look forward to hearing the audience feedback, especially on this last question. And I thank you for your attention. David?
Thank you, Siobhan. So we're going to fast forward about 100 years and take the scope of analysis from the larger Gulf region we've been speaking about so far. And actually, we're going to take an interest and take a look at Abu Dhabi, the Emirate, and Abu Dhabi, the city, from around the time of its founding, federalization, about 50 years ago this year, and through the lens of a, perhaps for some people in the audience, an unusual source, and that is phone directories. So in the graph on the slide at the bottom right-hand side, you can see, for those of you who are not familiar with the case of the UAE, just how much the population grew from 1970 through about 2010. And that's precisely the moment for which we have a very, very interesting set of source materials. I wandered into NYU Abu Dhabi Archives and Special Collections one day to speak with the head archivist, and noticed that a series of phone books had just been given to special collections. And I, of course, asked, what are those going to be used for? Because my eyes, of course, lit up as someone who's interested in these kinds of source material. We have about 16 yellow pages, so business directories that are classified topically. 19 white pages, so personal and business listings that were given alphabetically, in addition to a whole bunch of ephemera that really span this whole time period of the growth of the UAE. So for those of you who don't know, Abu Dhabi is a city. It's a relatively large city, over 900 square kilometers, but you can see that the population expanded significantly from 1970 to today. We're at about 1.5 million. So this is part of the Frauke Hurd Bey and David Hurd collection in our archives and special collections. So why would we want to use those as a source? Well, there's actually in one of my specialty fields known as spatial humanities or geospatial humanities, it's actually quite a lot of work being done globally with such directories, business directories, phone directories. So on the screen here are some examples from, there's the Addressing History Project in Edinburgh, the Work Projects Administration Directory in New Orleans, the Bottin du Commerce for the Parisian art market, New York City directories, and one also with the Syrian American Business Directory for New York City. Now, these were relatively smaller scaled projects with certainly not volumes and not dozens and dozens of volumes with hundreds of thousands of names in them. But the idea was that by using such directories, by creating them as structured data, extracting that data from basically OCR pages, that you could tell something about who lived where or what businesses were located where. And that gave you a really interesting insight into the development of the urban fabric and built space. And so these projects are the kind of projects that I teach on a regular basis. Actually, the In and Of the Syrian Community was created by students of mine in a course. And so, of course, when I saw that we had such directories for Abu Dhabi, I was really, really thrilled. So with a grant from the NYU Center for Humanities for Digital Humanities Startup Grant, we've begun this project last year called Abu Dhabi Calling. And it's a little hard, actually, when one looks at the question of the phone book or the phone directory in an Arab world context, because Arab world cities don't have unified addressing systems, or they at least didn't have unified addressing systems historically speaking. Abu Dhabi, for example, put in place their unified addressing system in 2015 only. So in the Abu Dhabi phone books, for example, we have names of people, we have PO box numbers and phone numbers. In other cases, so if we look at, for example, Tunis, a phone book that I acquired this year from 1961, just after independence, that I'm actually working on in a class, there you actually have name, person, profession, addressing system, and phone number, which makes for the geolocation of all of the names in those phone books. It makes it quite easy. So we have to think about this particular source and what it can actually tell us about Abu Dhabi. It certainly cannot locate a person to an exact latitude and longitude point on a map. But from the phone numbers, we can sort of, if you like, reverse engineer. We can go back. And there are phone numbers, if those of you who remember the way that phone books used to be put together, or phone systems in general were put together, they had things called exchanges. And so there are patterns in the numbers that help us identify how we can, where we can actually identify someone in the city. So we have a less granular, from the geospatial humanities perspective, analysis that's possible from these books. But we have a much more granular way of looking at people and places than we've had in any of the other projects that we talked about today. So really, this particular project, which we've been working on during COVID on the imaging and the data extraction phase for, really is a kind of a logical extension of how OpenGulf as a research group has actually developed. And what I mean by that is that in early years, whereas we turned to things that were easy to get our hands on, things that for which a lot of the work had already been done, and then started to add and extract data and enrich it, as in the case of Lorimer that Nora talked about, when we moved to AI transcription in the examples that Supan brought up with us from already digitized materials, this one really required us to go back to square one. So, right, so starting with imaging, then moving to data extraction. And that means that it's actually worked a whole lot more slowly than other projects that we've had. So one of the things that's evolved, that's appearing or it's emerging out of understanding the data from these phone books is the extent to which the phone books not only tell us about the people who lived historically in Abu Dhabi from the 1970s onward, but also it allows us to tell a story about the changing media ecology of the city. So on the right-hand side, you have a small map in the 1970 volumes. 1972 subscriber volume was actually possible to geolocate people by a point. So you have a map that where we actually have very specific points. But on the other two examples, which show some screenshots from a popular digital humanities data cleaning tool called OpenRefine, what you can see is as we begin to sort and clean and make sense of the data, what we're finding is that we have really interesting patterns of what I've been calling resource sharing. So those of you who might remember the comedy, the comedic value of the party line that existed in cities once upon a time, there were sort of shared PO boxes and seemingly shared phone numbers. Now, whether that actually points to families, members of the same family who shared the same phone number, or actually different families or people who shared lines, we don't actually know that answer yet. But what we're beginning to see here is that there are ways that we can begin to understand networks of people in a city via technology and this, as I called it, this media ecology, that are actually, I don't think that we have any other source for, at least that I know of, for the city in which we live that can help us get some insight into those. So the last thing that I'd like to say about this, which is the youngest project of OpenGulf, Abu Dhabi Calling, is that we're actually seeing that the phone book itself is not just an index, but it's actually a site for an evolving spatial awareness of the city itself. And so on the timeline here from the 1980s through to 2007, you can see the kind of insertion of constant insertion actually of maps and and spatial representations in these guides as a way of bringing people obviously not only to postal or telephone infrastructure, but also to the places themselves. And to the point where we get in 2007, which of course postdates the existence of Google Maps, something that even looks like some kind of proto-Google Maps that's divided up by block, right, and inserted for large parts of the city. Of course, what I want to do with these is move forward once the other data collection is done and georeference these and think more deeply about that, but that's for another day. So in the Abu Dhabi Calling project, I think there are some interesting emergent research questions. Like, first of all, how can a phone directory become a data set? Second, what kinds of ethical concerns arise when we digitize sources from the 20th century, and in particular from the 20th century Gulf region? Third, how do such sources help us understand a real hot topic in Gulf studies, the kind of dialectic between the permanence of these cities and the transience, right, in a moment of really expansive growth? And finally, how do digital mapping projects like this one from the non-Western world deal with location, but also how do they open up new questions for spatial humanities research, my field of expertise, a field that's almost exclusively situated in the West? So what I'd like to just, in order to conclude today, is I'd like to bring us to this idea that I guess what sort of the storyline of our presentation today is that from beginning with some projects which dealt with an iconic text for understanding the history of the Gulf, Lorimer's Gazetteer, and then evolving into this transdisciplinary research group has meant really opening up lots and lots of interesting possibilities for expanding the archive of what we consider to be Gulf studies. We've of course turned to these non-traditional sources, as I showed you in the case of the phone books, and we have our eye on others. Nora mentioned one of them, which is the circulation of thinking about historical documents in social media, a very common practice in the Gulf region, as well as thinking about web archiving and as a way of kind of understanding the past of the internet in the Gulf. Our hope is, of course, to sketch out a much wider and broader notion of the archive that has ever been done before. So by way of conclusion, I think that if I can just sum up some of the things that happen to us as a research group as we start thinking this way, is of course, we have to develop infrastructure and workflows. Right? You can't have 20 people working on a project when you don't have very clear, and those are not always obvious in the beginning. There's a lot of trial and error in this kind of research. We also have to train core researchers and students with an eye for the cycles of academic life. And what I mean by that is that faculty members leave, students leave, people move around. And so in that way, in some ways, the turn to remote instruction and research during the pandemic was a kind of a jump start for us. We had to really shift very quickly into remote modes of team communication and project management. We've also had to discover how to use source materials, find source materials, even digitize source materials in unconventional and sometimes uncomfortable surroundings. The project of imaging those phone books was actually very difficult to pull off. We didn't really have the infrastructure for it. We did it. But it was not an obvious process. We also have begun to explore how the nature of research changes as more diverse materials become accessible. When you have different kinds of materials in different states of digitization, really new methods have to kind of step in to help you there. We've also found it challenging to accommodate the diversity of interests in the research group. These projects are not all things that have automatically interested me or Subhan or Nora. And when students get hold of these projects, they inevitably take them off into interesting new directions. I think that the last two things that I'd like to say, which are really important for us, is that commitment to the core values that I mentioned in the beginning is really important, and it goes into the project design of every single project that we have. So openness, centering new voices in the field, critical comparative stances to colonial legacies, thinking about foregrounding training in new methods for historical inquiry, and finally, fair compensation for student work, to be perfectly honest. Also, a research group like this is not automatically sustainable. We have no space, we have no budget besides the budget of the individual researcher faculty members. We'd like to invite you to check out our website, in which we have some of the materials, some of the products of our research. There are some interactive maps there. There are data sets. This is actually built as a GitHub static site, and so it's connected to a data repository. So when we finish and complete our data sets, we place them there. So this is, of course, this idea is the site itself kind of embodies the very values of the project, right? So we'd like to invite you to check that out, and we hope that you'll stay in touch, and we look forward to the discussion today. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
Thank you. That was really wonderful, fascinating, beautifully done, beautiful visuals. I've had the opportunity to look through the site. It's really very impressive, and it really invites imagination of all the different directions that you have headed in and can head into the future. I have a few questions I'll begin with, and then we'll please, people in the audience, feel free to add your questions in the Q&A, and we will have time to get to those as well, certainly. So I guess, David, you just talked about this a little bit, but since you ended on this all throughout the question to Nora or Supan, to reflect a little bit, my questions are going to kind of go backwards from the end of your presentation back to the beginning, to reflect a little bit about the challenges and opportunities of such a large scale trans-regional collaborative project, especially during a time of crisis. So in some ways, the move to virtual and online is distinctly suited for a project like this, but you also have a team over many different time zones and places. And there's such a turn and interest to collaborative research, especially from funders. And so I was just wondering if you want to talk a little bit more about the distinct challenges and opportunities therein, but also how that may change or redirect the kinds of research questions that you're asking for this project, but perhaps also in your own independent research. So what are the challenges and gains from collaborative work of this kind? And Nora or Supan, either one of you who would like to take that.
I can say a quick words about it, then I'll pass it to Nora. This was definitely one of the silver linings for me of the pandemic, which is not a great thing to look for a silver lining in a pandemic, but the OpenGulf project in general and my personal collaborative projects really seem to have taken off with the wide availability of online resources. It just made collaboration so much easier in a sense, because it was, more acceptable or easily doable. But on the other hand, like David pointed out, it is not easy to coordinate the work of so many people who are in different parts of the world. So we needed to experiment and try out different platforms to share the documents or share the data we created, and to co-write papers or prepare presentations. That has taken some experimentation. I have to say, I did acquire one or two project management skills and familiarize myself with a number of project management platforms in the process, which is a learning curve. Sometimes it can be a steep learning curve, but in the long term, I personally find this a very helpful and very productive experience for myself. That these are the skills, the platforms that I became familiar with over the last 1.5 years or so are the kind of things that I am sure that I will be using in the long term in my other work and other projects.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Natalie. I feel like the pandemic, in a way, sort of eased OpenGulf's transition into a multi-institution, multi-arm beast, right? And I mentioned this in the presentation, that partly had to do with me moving to Stanford, but it was also like, we have, I know Neda was in the audience a minute ago, she's still there, Neda and Maggie, who is still working actively with OpenGulf and finished a postgraduate research fellowship at NYU AD and then moved to Georgetown. There's a couple of other people who have similar trajectories. And so, and we started working with, now we have a very active postdoctoral researcher at Cambridge. So it sort of mushroomed in that space. And I think it did have a lot to do with the fact that everybody was online and everybody was suddenly in this new mode of work where working across time zones and mainly on screens, like I haven't seen David in person in, I don't know, a very long time, but we're constantly on screen together, became sort of more normalized, for better or for worse. Yeah, I have started to become very frustrated, honestly, with my non-collaborative work because of this project, and sort of just wanted it to finish quickly, and so that I can get back to working collaboratively. It has become a much more sort of not only natural, but also ethical way of working for me. I think the way that my discipline, history, is built around single author monographs doesn't really reflect all of the conversations, all of the student researchers, all of the really deeply collaborative work that goes into research outputs. And I have found that the kind of work that we're doing here, and also for me, it's really been deeply pedagogical, right? Like really been about training students so that they can train others, bringing in, giving credit where credit is due, compensation, but also, co-presenting, co-authoring, all of these kinds of practices that I really hope, I'm not at all positive, but I really hope are the future of my field and the humanities in general. It's sort of given me more, to be perfectly honest, it's given me more hope about the future of those endeavors, right? When we're constantly, in the context of a constant conversation about crisis in the humanities. So I think like that, that collaborative mode of work, it's become sort of hard for me to imagine working otherwise. And that has everything to do with honestly the way that, those statements of mission and statements of I forget what he called them, project characteristics, they really come from David and from David's long experience with digital humanities practices, that he brought to NYU Abu Dhabi. And I've sort of learned about them and learned about best project management practices through working with David. And so I think that's, for me, this major sort of sea change in the way, not only that I do research, but also that I think about research as an endeavor.
Sorry, that's really fascinating. There's a question, I have several questions, but I'm gonna ask a question from the Q&A that takes off of that. But I actually, it's really interesting to hear both of what you said, but also the sense that Nora, what you said in the end, that you're actually frustrated with your independent scholarship and would like to go to the collaborative. Just because of my own experience, I've been struggling with this too. There is a shift in time frame of research, right? I mean, we've been trained as independent scholars to try to, it's all about kind of producing as much as you can, as quickly as you can. And maybe you've had a different experience, but collaborative work, including many people, you talked about this project, it's really coming into its own through the crisis, but it's been developing over 3 years. And, not that our single monographs go that much faster, they certainly don't, but I think it's true, as you point out, this is really the future of the humanities, perhaps, but then it also invites questions about what is expected of people in terms of, we kind of have to demonstrate our outputs in a different way, because they may, with a lot of people working on things, they may also evolve along different time scales, right? The scale of your project is different, the time is different, the space is different. So it's going against a number of different of expectations for funding cycles, for instance, right? Funding cycles are usually a year or two. You're talking about a project that is really developing over a longer period of time. You can talk about that as I put, if you'd like or not, as I add this question from an anonymous attendee about the ethics and the political and ethical difficulties you have faced or expect to face with this project, which I think comes right off of what you're talking about, the challenges, opportunities, but also the value-driven nature of this project. So David, I'll throw that to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question, and thank you, anonymous attendee, for that question. I appreciate it. I think, let me talk about the political first. I think that anytime one brings and mobilizes new sources to challenge historical narratives or to nuance historical narratives, you always open the door to dislodging official narratives, right? Or not even official narratives, just scholarly debate continues. And so I think that's possible anywhere in the world. And I don't think I've actually felt that in particular. I know that, Lorimer's, the way that Lorimer, for example, divides up the world of the Gulf is not the way that it's divided up nowadays. And so we find and are constantly uncovering all kinds of large cultural and political shifts in our materials. But I'd like to speak a little bit more about the ethical, because I think the ethical for me is a very important one. Anytime we take materials from the human record and we digitize them, we make them into data, we run a risk, right? Because things which have been made into data can be consumed as data. And so let me take, in very specific terms, the case of the phone books project. The phone books are a great example of not a living archive in the sense that they're constantly changing. Although actually, if you have the skills, you can go and scrape online phone books, right, from the Yellow Pages in the UAE. You could do that if you really wanted to. But they're living in the sense that a lot of the people who are in those phone books are still around, and the families are still around, right? And although the phone books don't say where they live, they give access to names, right? So this is one of these questions that comes up a lot, increasingly in the GLAM sector, in the sector of the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. To what extent modern records can and should be digitized for research. And so we're thinking about ways of how we can work with that. Of course, that's not going to be one of the data sets that we would publish openly. That's not, but we are imagining in collaboration with my colleague in research computing, ways that that data set can be interacted with, but can be interacted with through, if you like, a kind of anonymized fashion, either by swapping out phone numbers or changing names, to see, so that people have some access to it, right? So there's actually a value to the larger scholarly community without being a risk. I think the other thing which is necessarily ethical about projects like that, but also of any of the named entity recognition that Supan was talking about in her section, or anything that any of the projects we deal with, as soon as we activate machine learning, by which I mean we activate an algorithm that can decide on behalf of our project that a name, for example, is a Persian name, or a name is a name that comes from a specific Indian language, or that name is an Arab name and probably an Egyptian name and not a Lebanese name, for example. Those kinds of decisions that you could automate across a very large data set. Anytime you do that, the basic assumptions of the algorithm have the possibility of changing the outcomes of research, right? And that's just that's just a basic question right now with people working in digital humanities, in particular in digital humanities that use lots of data or that use machine learning. So, we're going to have to think about that and try to mitigate that and work with ethical data science practices that help us understand how best to work with that. So I'll stop there. I'll let my colleagues chime in if they have something to say about politics or ethics. Thanks.
I do have nothing to say about the political difficulties at the moment, at least yet, but I would like to really briefly comment on what, David, you mentioned about using algorithms for large data sets, and the question of the bias in the algorithm is not always very obvious to humanities scholars. We sometimes imagine that this is concern of some programmers or developers in Silicon Valley, but and it was personally, I'm a historian by training. I'm not a developer, and it was one of the most surprising aspects of the work for me when I first started working with HDR, to realize how much of my own linguistic and cultural bias I can actually embed into the workflow, and what kind of long-term implications that kind of bias might have potentially for the scholars that will be using the models that I am creating. It is also the same case for algorithm to recognize place names and personal names. And we are choosing to teach the algorithm to produce an output in a very specific way that we find useful, or that we find the correct way of doing it. And I personally do not see a way around it. David, you might be, you might have an answer to this question, but my answer is, at the moment at least, to at least acknowledge that, that this is a problem also in humanities, or a challenge, or something that we should be aware of in humanities research. And the one thing I really appreciate about OpenGulf is this attempt to create more diverse data sets by including researchers or students from different linguistic backgrounds, so that we can produce a number of different data sets with, that have different assumptions, and then just share these data sets openly, so that researchers can experiment for themselves and use different versions possibly of the same models, same HDR models, for example. So that awareness needs to be there, even if we don't have an answer, a solution to the problem. And then again, another alternative position that OpenGulf takes is to try to produce more diverse data as a response to this.
Yeah, I mean, I can come at it from a slightly different, less algorithmic perspective. This is something that David and I have sort of just started to talk about, and I think are only beginning to sort of articulate. So what I say may be a bit uncooked, but I think what I see as kind of one of the political projects of OpenGulf is a new take on the archival landscape of the Gulf. And actually, the archival landscape of the Gulf is not that different from what I know of the wider region. And here I'm thinking about the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula. But of course, this also, I imagine, has different iterations in the Indian Ocean world. I'm just not as familiar with that archivally. And that's one that spends less time sort of critiquing the state archive, which is something that there's exciting new literature about in the field, and more time sort of focusing on the opportunity of the multi-layered and highly variegated different kinds of textual and corpus collection that's going on in the region. And we've mentioned a couple of times social media. That's one really important site for that. Another really important site is places like NYUAD Special Collections and their acquisition of private collections, right? Which is such an important, process across the region. These private collections, most historians will tell you, is where a lot of the really important non-imperial perspectival stories can be told about the region. So I think that's sort of an important element of the kinds of politics that this project is trying to embrace, right? Like seeing that that situation as sure a moment of critique when we think about state archive, but beyond that, thinking about it as a moment of opportunity for researchers to sort of interact with historical texts beyond the edifice of the state archive.
Wonderful. I thank you so much for that. There are a couple questions now about the digital aspect and pedagogy, but Nora, you were just talking a little bit, and this is a question I was thinking early on when you were talking about how this started in your class with Lorimer, and then now you're moved to other texts and languages, and I was just wondering about, as you're doing this, is it, one question is how your own research questions may be changing through this digital humanities process and aspect or methodology, but also have you thought about, could you say a little bit about your ideas about centering on the Gulf as opposed to the Arabian Peninsula? I mean, it is a wonderful name, OpenGulf, but there is a kind of that itself, I wonder, is a little bit centered in the fact of English language scholarship and a certain kind of, predominance of archival material that kind of from which Gulf studies emerges. And so I'm just wondering about your decisions about Gulf versus Arabian Peninsula and kind of the broader region and how you might see this expanding or not necessarily, right? But just when you were defining your project, what you were thinking about that. That's to any of you since you all just spoke. But I guess Nora, I said, since starting your class.
Yeah, no, this is what I said about being sort of uncomfortable spending so much time on a colonial, on one colonial text was very much sort of this uneasiness that I've had throughout in our work with Lorimer. In order for this to be a really collaborative project that was working actively with student assistants, even in a place like NYUAD, which now that I'm located in an American university, I feel like the linguistic diversity at NYUAD was just, obviously so capacious in comparison. But, working with an English text allowed us to really reach out, as I was trying to articulate in the presentation, to students across a really broad language spectrum, right? So it was helpful if they had some knowledge of the Arabic alphabet, but that could come from knowledge of, Urdu. It could come from knowledge of Persian. It didn't need, we weren't, really centering Arabic language abilities in the process. And I'm just saying that because you were asking about the Arabian Peninsula, but I think that decision to work with an English text was also, and to keep on with that, was also related to the environment we were in and the English language medium that we were in, right? That is something that unites the student body. And that really goes back to the pedagogical questions that people are bringing up in the chat, right? Where that kind of training and involvement and collaboration was in a way winning out over me wanting to work on Ottoman texts or even Arabic texts, right? Which really limits us to a different community, frankly. And so all of that has meant that we've done that sort of branching out in sort of sub-projects, right? So like we have, a team working on Ottoman texts, and we'll have a team working on Arabic texts. We had a student over the summer working specifically in Persian. But I think that we will always struggle with that because the Lorimer project did end up in some ways defining a geographical scope. And it's one that we're constantly coming up against, right? Like, how much are we going to let that be the case? And one that we're constantly sort of, how much are we going to think about? This reminds me, incidentally, Natalie, of many, conversations about what it means to be an Arab crossword studies program, right? Like, what are the initial boundaries of this, and how much are we going to push that, and how much are we going to put a box for us, this obviously deeply meaningful geographical spatial box, which is really what the project is about. So I'm not going to, David may have a cleaner answer for that question than I do, but I think, I at least, it's very clear to me why we sort of kept with that that particular text that, as I said, does come out in your characterization of Gulf studies is one that I completely agree with, very much comes out of that world. And that we're sort of, I think, in the long term, always going to be in conversation with that anchoring to a certain extent. But David, I'm curious to hear what you think about this.
Let me actually, sorry, just because of time, we have 15 minutes. So you can maybe wrap this in, but we have 3 questions about pedagogy. So I would like to actually kind of get to the questions from the audience. So we have first of all, thank you for the many insights on the arms, the many OpenGulf. As a more qualitatively trained student, this is from a student on the project. I'm wondering how a digital quantitative methodologies can be incorporated earlier and more widely in the undergraduate experience, especially in the arts and humanities, as another methodological lens. And David, I wanted to ask you this.
Yeah, thank you, Nada, for the question. I think it's a really great one. First of all, I mean, this is the bread and butter of what I do at NYU Abu Dhabi. I have a palette of courses in which I'm teaching such methods, but not just teaching methods and skills and quantitative approaches, but teaching topical approaches using those methods. And so, of course, there's a certain portion of the student population that's getting that kind of education, right? The people who are signed up for my courses. But what's interesting is that they're not always arts and humanities majors, right? What you actually get very interestingly are people who are coming from computer science and IM who are actually fascinated that there are possibilities for quantitative work in topics from the arts and humanities. So I think there's a larger question there for, first of all, building out more of an offer, having other people on the faculty, Supan included, being able, and others who are interested in that, in trying that in their courses. But I think that's not just a question about changing the undergraduate curriculum. It's about a shift in institutional culture and the saying that it's okay for such things to be done. And so another one of my sort of self-appointed mandates at the institution has been thinking about training and thinking about ways of bringing people awareness of such skills, such methods, bringing their awareness to those methods and modeling for them how they could actually do that as a portion of their class. I mean, I certainly hope that one day we'll have a curriculum which has more things on offer, maybe even a certificate or a small program or something like that. But I think that's off in the distance. I think what has to happen is there has to be a feeling amongst arts and humanities students that that's actually a valuable endeavor. And I think that's an open conversation. We haven't actually completed that one. And I'd be interested if anyone has any ideas about how to go about doing that, how to reach out across that divide.
I think that goes nicely and ties in with the next question from the audience, which is how you have used, perhaps, Supan, can you talk a little bit about how you've used OpenGulf in your classroom? And, and then I'll broaden that to the other two of you as well, and how you envision other instructors using this site and your data in their teaching across various fields.
Thank you. I have not used any of the data sets created or available on the platform in my classes, but I do use some of the tools and platforms that we use in OpenGulf as a gentle way of introducing my students to these methods and to this, thinking of approaching their research material. This also, I think, kind of ties into the previous question. For example, I mean, I am teaching history courses, so I make all the digital humanities component of the course optional. I'm always worried about intimidating the students with the tools or with some of the ideas. But so far, I have to say this is my second semester teaching using these tools, especially annotating, geographic annotating, and data visualization. So far, the reception of the students has been extremely positive, and I always get feedback such as, why have we not taught this before? Why is it the first time that I have ever heard about this platform or this particular way of, producing research project? And what I personally do is, like David suggested, to model using these tools and these ways of producing scholarly knowledge. So I would, for example, create a map myself based on a historical text that I assign as a primary source. For example, I will go ahead and annotate and create a map and use it in my lectures, for example, to show my students the possibilities of these platforms. Or I, for example, create instead of producing a service, I use a website. I use a particular citation management and data management platform. So these are my ways of gently introducing the students to these tools. And once they, we are talking about the digital native generation, once they see you use those kind of tools, they are already, onto it, and they are embracing and adapting those kind of methods of doing, of reading, of producing scholarship immediately. So yeah, my take from the OpenGulf, this was a very long answer to the question, but my particular take on that is to use the tools, the skills, and use them to my teaching and my classroom in
Thank you. We have 2 questions left that I want to get in here, and at least, and I kind of want to, because it started in Nora's class, I'm going to come back to you a little bit later. Well, actually, so I'm going to go back to David here. Here's a question about teaching and how you sustain, also because you're teaching a lot of classes undergraduate in the digital humanities, how you sustain undergraduates' research interest in one project. It's wonderful to see undergraduate students who went on to graduate study and continue to actively engage with the project, but now due to information exploration, students constantly change their research topics and interests, and even during the course of a semester. So especially because it takes so long, as you pointed out, a semester long of entering data and things like that, how do you sustain students' interests in this?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a super question. I mean, I think it's important to be realistic about what can actually happen in the span of a semester, right? So the kind of, I've increasingly moved my teaching to being almost half the semester being project-based learning. So the idea is that sort of the first part of the semester is about introduction to the topic, sort of general sketches of the questions that we'd like to answer or to address, at least if we don't have answers for them, to learn some tools, learn some ways of thinking about data. But I have to do actually, and then passing in the second part of the semester to lots of hands-on. But my kind of magic formula for this is imagining a common data set, which is actually similar to what we do in OpenGulf, actually. So we contribute to something in common. And I end up doing a lot of the scaffolding for that, getting it set up. Like in any good pedagogy, you have your assignment appropriately scoped and appropriately set up. But then from a common data set that has many different angles, and I think one of the things that's great about humanities data sets is how much they can be made to speak, right? There's so many things, so many stories that can come about. And I use story in that sense of data storytelling, right? There's so many ways of narrating a data set. And so if you have a good complex data set that is of a specific, of a good size, like say a phone book from a specific year in a specific country, and you have the project turn on that, what students can do is then sort of find the thing that's of interest to them. Now, this doesn't actually, to go to Sean's question about interest, I mean, as part of the course, right? Like part of the course is following and carrying out that project. I'm actually not trying to push students into OpenGulf work in the classroom. I don't actually think that's probably ethical to do, right? To mobilize a classroom to create data for a project. That's not really what I'm interested in doing. But we can use OpenGulf materials and use a variety of other materials and other projects that have been created in many other parts of the world by other digital humanists as kind of prompts for students, right? Or as models for ways of imagining the way that they might be able to carry out some research. And my impression is that when it's well scaffolded, when the question of digital methods, their benefits and their limitations are made very clear, and I'm straightforward with students about what they can't do and the limitations of what we are not able to do in a given semester, they actually produce really excellent material. I mean, they really do. The other small thing that I would add to that is group work works. And so just like team-based research at the faculty level right, at the level of OpenGulf is a valuable endeavor. Having students with sort of differing skills, differing skill sets, maybe having someone who's a stronger writer, having someone who's a stronger in data preparation, having someone who's stronger in design, right? And sort of putting those heads together, I find that that is a good way of a student maintaining an interest in a project, participating with what they're good at, and still reaping the benefits of innovative methods and thinking, as opposed to throwing upon someone who doesn't quite know what to do and really needs input from others, sort of giving them just a project and saying, go off and do it. So we try to, and it's almost like modeling the lab environment inside of the classroom. That's the way I would answer that question. Thank you very much for it.
Thank you. Nora, I want to ask you if you've used OpenGulf in your classroom and what that translates now outside of the Gulf, right? How your students may or may not engage with it when they're not located here. But I also want to, ask you, I mean, I'm kind of piggybacking these questions together. Since this started in your classroom and since you were new to the digital humanities when you began this, what the most interesting, and this is from a question from an anonymous attendee, what the most interesting, surprising, or random finding was for you in taking on this project?
I want to just say something really quickly. I'll get to what I've done in my classroom, and I know we only have 3 minutes, about the previous question about sustaining student interest, especially from undergraduate to graduate work. And I really think that one thing that we've done very well is give students opportunities that they can then put on their CV that teach them about the academic profession. Like specifically, we have students participate in public presentations or academic presentations. We have students creating trainings. We have students doing blog posts that are published on the site. What else? We're co-authoring with a student right now. I mean, these kinds of things I think have kept students really sustained, involved in OpenGulf specifically, not so much in the classroom setting long-term. That said, there is a long list of students that have been involved in this project, and the list of people who have stayed with us for multiple semesters or, through beyond an institutional transition is relatively small. So there's there's also a hit or miss element there. Have I used OpenGulf in the classroom? So yeah, I'm in a similar situation to Subhan, but in a way it's even more challenging because not only am I teaching in a history department, I'm also teaching on a quarter system at Stanford. So I only have 10 weeks. What I have done is integrated, now I always have a digital final project option. I give students a lot of options for what they could do for that and model some of that. I've done more of the, project-based teaching students, for example, how to map, very much in the way that David initially came into my history and the environment class, right? So, taking as a historical text, like Subhan said, but not necessarily mapping it for a lecture, actually sitting with the students and having them annotate the text collaboratively and then showing them how to come up with a map. The challenge for me teaching in a history department is, in order to use the data sets that we've created in OpenGulf so far and published, I have to do quite a bit of ground training work for students to even be able to get to a point where they can create something with that data specifically, right? And that has everything to do with the constrictions of my discipline as it exists so far and what pedagogy is imagined as, right? So, and it also just has to do, I'm very new at Stanford and haven't taught it. We have doing digital history classes. There are many ways where I could bring OpenGulf in as I continue to sort of variegate my teaching portfolio. What's the most interesting, surprising, random finding? We didn't talk about this and I don't want to go way off on a tangent, but we've been working for the past year or so now on digitizing an Ottoman map of the winter grazing grounds of tribes in the Arabian Peninsula and Iraq, and then comparing that to what the British, specifically Lorimer, were saying about the same kinds of problems. And this for me has, it's really, this is a topic that I'm writing a book about in the Eastern Mediterranean context, and it's changed, the way I think about how the Ottoman Empire was thinking about the relationship between population and space, the way that I sort of read text and come at that text with those questions. So that's just one, sort of way that this has affected my broader research. You can look at the camel map on our website, or the date palm map that also yields, sometimes surprising findings if you know the context about where the most camels were, where the most date were. I mean, there's also, if you're looking for something more nitty gritty and empirical, there's also stuff like that. But I'll stop there. I think we're over time.
No, it's perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who attended. Go check out the website. It's lovely. It's gorgeous. I wish I could have you. David, you may be in danger of everyone wanting you to come to their classroom and continue this. Yes, we look forward to seeing this develop into the future in the coming semesters. It's an amazing project. Thank you so much.